Is Vincent van Gogh actually dead? No. No, of course he's dead. That's not what this video is about. He definitely died 134 years ago on the 29th of July 1890. That's not up for debate. What has been up for debate for the last decade or so is how it happened. But Tom, I hear you cry, everyone knows he shot himself. He was depressed, he'd struggled with it for his whole life. Everyone knew he had mental health issues, and he'd finally had enough that summer's day in 1890. And that was the prevailing theory for 121 years. Until in 2011, when two biographers emerged with a somewhat different idea. But to understand that, it's probably a good idea to go over the details of what has widely been accepted as the true ending of one of the world's most famous, celebrated artists. I'm also going to try and paint the man himself in his own style, so we'll see how that goes. So, let's go back to 1889, where we find a man in a very, very poor state of mental health. Van Gogh had always suffered with poor mental health, but he was rapidly approaching one of the worst bouts of depression he would ever have. He was staying in the Yellow House in Arles in France, and he was expecting a visit from his friend and fellow artist, Paul Gauguin. And in correspondence between the two, he seemed to be in good spirits, exclaiming that Gauguin would see miles and miles of countryside of different kinds with autumn splendours on his journey to Arles. He was looking forward to something of an artist's retreat, where both of them would encourage and inspire each other to create wonderful paintings. But in that correspondence, there were also some potential red flags that all was not well with Vincent. Right, so I know this is just a painting, but it terrifies me. So I don't paint that often. I've done oil painting before, but this is a very specific technique. And it looks messy, and you think, messy, it's probably easy. That's never usually the case. So I'm terrified. And I've also only got a couple of hours to get it done, so this is going to be really interesting to see how it turns out. At least I get to do it outside, like the man himself would have appreciated. Wish me luck. In those letters to Gauguin, he'd also reported a recent bout of eye strain that had forced him to remain indoors and paint an interior with a simplicity à la Seurat, like the works of Georges Seurat. I am clearly very, very deeply French. He also told Gauguin, I often don't know what I'm doing, working almost like a sleepwalker. This level of honesty and intimacy between the two was not unusual, and they're definitely close on both a personal and professional level. So from that correspondence, we have the knowledge that Van Gogh was suffering from stress, from eye strain, and was drifting somewhat, and it was having a detrimental effect on both his physical and mental health. And really, the whole purpose of Van Gogh's move from Paris to Arles did kind of feel like a means to try and heal himself through a kind of utopian existence surrounded by beautiful countryside and his fellow painters. Now, Gauguin was definitely moving there to spend time with his friend, but he definitely had business on his mind at the same time. And half the reason he agreed to join Van Gogh at his retreat was that he'd been promised financial support from his art dealer, who also happened to be Van Gogh's younger brother, Theo. So he probably didn't have quite the same romantic view of the setup that Van Gogh was clearly so keen on. And what followed were 9 intense weeks, where a lot of painting happened, but they also often quarrelled as they worked. And over that time, their friendship, along with Van Gogh's fragile mental health, deteriorated. And though both artists managed to produce a lot of work during those 9 weeks, it ultimately culminated in one of the most famous or infamous incidents in art history. And the only thing Van Gogh is probably more famous for than his art. It's not clear exactly how it happened, but it is believed that after a final furious row with Gauguin, Van Gogh hacked off his ear, packaged it up, and gave it to a prostitute in a nearby brothel. Technically, that last bit about the brothel is only alleged. though art historian Bernadette Murphy believes that it was actually a woman called Gabrielle, or Gabby, who was unexpectedly the recipient of the boxed up, rather bloody surprise from the somewhat dishevelled artist. That's about as good as the information we have gets, though, because she ultimately never really spoke about it and never tried to seek out Van Gogh after it happened. Unsurprisingly, not wanting to seek out the dishevelled bloody man who unexpectedly shoved a boxed up bloody ear into her hands. So we already have a very gory glimpse into the kinds of weird self-mutilation Van Gogh was capable of, which may also help to explain some of the later weirdness we'll get to. Gauguin, probably understandably a little put off by the display of extreme self-mutilation, left immediately, and the two never saw each other again, though they did maintain something of a correspondence, and Van Gogh's brother Theo did continue to represent Gauguin as his art dealer. As for what happened to Van Gogh next, a public petition was launched with, let's say, somewhat dubious signatories. It seems like they really just wanted him out of there, and I get it, the guy just chopped off his own ear after an argument, and the more I think about it, that is kind of the most insane thing you can do to end an argument. Before even coming to blows with the person that you're arguing with, you chop off your own ear, as if to say, I'll chop off my own ear, mate. I don't care. I'm nuts. If I'll chop off my own ear, just imagine what I'll do to you. He clearly wasn't in a good place. So this petition was launched, and he was kicked out of Arles, and straight into a hospital. And during his time in hospital, he did seem to improve somewhat, but just before he was discharged, he asked to be put in an asylum. His brother and art dealer, don't forget, Theo, initially resisted the idea of him going to an asylum, but he eventually backed down by about May 1889, and Van Gogh entered an asylum near Saint-Rémy. Now here, he did stay stable for quite a while, and he continued to produce work while he was there. And in fact, it was during his stay in this asylum that he produced one of his most iconic paintings, The Starry Night. But between July 1889 and March 1890, he suffered a series of quite serious relapses before he was eventually actually discharged in May 1890. And possibly the best depiction of his mental state at that time is the last painting he produced when in the asylum, At Eternity's Gate. And this is where he moved to, and I don't think I'm going to be able to say this correctly, so I'll leave it to Google.
Auvers-sur-Oise.
There you go. A commune that was quite popular with artists. And it was here that his mental health seemed to improve. We have many letters to his family and friends that appear to indicate that he's feeling much better being out of the asylum and in the countryside and painting in the fresh air again. Though a letter to his brother from the 2nd of July possibly betrays a little of how he may have actually been feeling. I am also trying to do as well as I can, but I will not conceal from you that I hardly dare count on always being in good health. And if my disease returns, you will forgive me. I still love art and life very much. Those sound very much like the words of a man still clearly battling depression on a daily basis, but really desperately trying to put up a positive front. In his next letter to Theo, on the 10th of July, some of the pretenses dropped and we start to see how he's actually feeling. He starts, I am very well. I'm working hard. I've painted 4 studies and 2 drawings. But a little honesty starts to creep in, with him going on to admit, I don't know what to say. Certainly my last attack, which was terrible, was in large measure due to the influence of the other patients. For myself, I can only say at the moment that I think we all need rest. I feel like a failure. Je me sens raté, and the prospect grows darker. I see no happy future at all. And here are some of the paintings that he produced during this period of, as he himself describes, vast stretches of corn under troubled skies. And the correspondences continued between Van Gogh and his family, and he did continue to try and put up a positive front in them. But it was clear his brother was starting to worry about him, and suggested on the 22nd of July that he consult his personal physician, Paul Gachet. But Van Gogh continued to try and convince his brother that all was well and he was only focused on his painting. Which neatly brings us to the 27th of July, 1890.
So far, I hate it. But we'll keep going anyway.
The following account of what happened comes from Adeline Ravoux, the 13-year-old daughter of the innkeeper at the inn where Van Gogh was staying. Now, it's important to remember that even though this is the best and probably most accurate witness account we have, it's still only that. An account she wrote when she was 76, so 63 years later. So there has to be some question of its reliability. But taking that into account, this is what she said. On the morning of the 27th of July, Van Gogh ate breakfast and then headed out, not telling anybody where he was going. Now, this wasn't necessarily unusual because he'd spend most of his time going out to paint in the countryside, and people weren't going to be questioning where he was off to every single day. And the family at the inn were used to his somewhat habitual comings and goings, which is why, when it got to about dusk and he still hadn't returned like usual, they started to worry. By around 9 p.m, Van Gogh stumbled in through the door, clutching his stomach. Adeline's mother asked him if there was a problem, to which he replied, clearly struggling, "No, but I have," as he made his way up the stairs to his room. Not long after that, Adeline's father thought he could hear groaning coming from Van Gogh's room, and upon entering, found him curled up in bed. And when he asked if Van Gogh was ill, Van Gogh slowly lowered the bedsheets to reveal a single bullet wound in his left abdomen, just below the heart. He then went on to admit that he had gone out to the wheat field where he'd spent a lot of recent days painting and attempted to kill himself with a revolver. Adeline's father then immediately went to fetch somebody to go for the local physician and found Anton Herschig, another Dutch painter who was also staying at the inn. And upon finding that the local physician was not available, they called for Paul Gachet. Now, Gachet eventually arrived, he dressed the wound, but clearly seemed to think that this was a hopeless case, and left almost immediately after doing what he could. Now, I don't know about you, but that definitely sounds like a guy who'd been there through all of Van Gogh's recent and not so recent struggles, and was finally like, oh, it's over. Adeline's father and the artist Herschig then spent the night at Van Gogh's bedside. During that night, Van Gogh was restless. He was in and out of consciousness, groaning sometimes, even smoking a few times. And in the morning, 2 gendarmes arrived, having heard of the shooting, to question Van Gogh. And there was clearly some doubt from the men about how the shooting had occurred, because Van Gogh's response was, "My body is mine, and I'm free to do with it what I want. Do not accuse anybody. It is I that wished to commit suicide." A telegram was also sent to Theo Van Gogh, his brother, who arrived later that afternoon. And he and Adeline's father continued to watch over Van Gogh. Later that day, Vincent van Gogh fell into a coma and passed away at about 1:30 in the morning. Theo did have a chance to speak briefly to his brother in that time that he was still conscious, and explained in a letter to his sister what had been said between the two. He himself wanted to die. When I sat at his bedside and said that we would try to get him better, and that we hoped that he would then be spared this kind of despair, he said, "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. I understood what he wanted to say with those words. We also have what Theo claimed were Van Gogh's last words in a letter mentioned in his wife's 1913 memoir. One of his last words was, "I wish I could pass away like this." And his wish was fulfilled. A few moments and all was over. He had found the rest he could not find on earth. Van Gogh's funeral was held on the afternoon of the 30th of July in a small cemetery just outside Auvers. And that, for the last 130 years, is what everyone agreed happened. Van Gogh, after a years-long mental decline, finally decided to end it all in a wheat field in France, / technically 2 days later in bed in an inn. Let's face it, Vincent van Gogh wasn't very good at topping himself. But hey, maybe it was just to add to the drama. Maybe he wanted to hang around long enough for someone to witness his final words. He didn't want to be on his own, so instead of one to the head, he went for one to the stomach, and then hung around for 2 days, making sure that everybody knew that he wanted to kill himself and it was him who did it. Or was it because it wasn't him that pulled the trigger? That is the theory posed in 2011 by Stephen Nafer and Gregory White Smith in their biography, Van Gogh, The Life. In their book, their argument covers a number of points that they claim point to the fact that Van Gogh did not take his own life. 1. They point to the upbeat appearance and vibrance of his last paintings as a sign that he had new vigor and enthusiasm for painting while surrounded by a new beautiful environment. 2. They looked at his many letters and found occasions where he described taking your own life as sinful and immoral. And they also looked more for the signs of positivity in his later correspondence that showed that he was gradually improving. 3. They questioned various aspects of the reported story. They asked how Van Gogh could have managed the mile-long walk back to the inn after shooting himself in the stomach. They asked how Van Gogh could have gotten his hands on a revolver because his mental health struggles were well known, so nobody should have been giving him a gun. And they asked why the revolver and Van Gogh's painting gear that he usually took with him were never found by the police. But Tom, you ask, again, that's all well and good. Maybe he didn't want to shoot himself. But if he didn't, who did? For that, Nafer and Smith turned to the account of a man named René Secretan, who came forward in 1956 following the release of the film Lust for Life, which was a biopic starring Kirk Douglas as Van Gogh. He spoke of summer holidays in Auvers when he was a teenager, and more specifically, of the weird Dutchman he and his brother kept bumping into. And instead of their usual summer pastimes like hanging around, fishing, there clearly wasn't a lot going on in late 1800s rural France. Or playing cowboys. What were young French lads doing playing cowboys in 1890? You might be asking. A show called Buffalo Bill's Wild West had been showing in Paris not long before this. And René at this point was clearly a budding cowboy with all the get-up. And so René and his brother Gaston, not that Gaston,
covered with hair,
took to tormenting the tramp. Supposedly they put salt in his coffee, chili on his brushes, and paraded girls from the Moulin Rouge in front of him to try and get some kind of a rise out of him. Messing about with a local painter when you're bored in the middle of summer doesn't immediately clearly lead straight to homicide. That would be something of an extreme escalation. And in his account of what happened that July, Secretan does not actually come out and say, "Oh, by the way, it was me that shot that bearded guy with the brushes." However, what he did indicate was that on that day, about a mile away from the wheat fields, behind a dung heap in Rue Boucher, a revolver was fired. And René and Gaston left Auvers that same day. Taking this account, along with the supposed fact that Van Gogh had gone drinking occasionally with the boys, Nafer and Smith proposed the following. Nafer said, so you have a couple of teenagers who have a malfunctioning gun, you have a boy who likes to play cowboy, and you have 3 people, probably all of whom have had too much to drink. Nafer and Smith claim that either René or Gaston, in their drunken excitement at being able to play cowboy with a real revolver, had accidentally shot Van Gogh in the stomach. In his poor mental state and having clearly gone through very dark periods before, Van Gogh had accepted his fate had been taken out of his own hands and did not want any blame to be cast on the boys. This, the biographers claim, is why he uttered, "Do not accuse anybody. It is I that wish to commit suicide," on his deathbed. So how likely is it that instead of the long-held belief that it was him who took his own life, it was actually a drunk teenager pretending to be Buffalo Bill. Let's take the argument piece by piece. So first things first, I think we can take the analysis of what his paintings and his letters really say and kind of disregard them. Nayfair and Smith claim that they show signs of improvement in Van Gogh, but there are also plenty of other historians who point out that they show signs of deteriorating mental health. Some see happy fields, some see turbulent skies. Some see the roots of growth and continuing life. Others see life struggle in those gnarled black roots with their knots, Van Gogh's own words. In fact, it has now been proven that this painting, Tree Roots, was definitely the last painting that Van Gogh ever produced. So take from that what you will. Now, I've been an English and art student for long enough in my life to know that nothing conclusive will ever be drawn from paintings and letters. Ultimately, it's art, and everyone will see something different in it. And most of the time, that's kind of the point. So instead, we turn to the physical evidence. Now, this is where I actually see something to the claims that it can't have been suicide. The only red flag for me, and it's probably something that you've also considered whilst watching this, is this. If Van Gogh wanted to kill himself, why did he shoot himself in the stomach? I don't know if that's just what people did in the 1800s, though I'm pretty sure even the average Joe would have known where the money shot is if you really want out. Perhaps Van Gogh had some romantic notion about shooting himself in the heart, taking himself out by destroying the body's poetic, emotional core. Regardless, it's a bit weird. I mean, even thinking about physically doing it that way, it's not exactly the most comfortable or practical way to do it. I mean, I don't know, maybe he was double jointed and it was super easy for him to reverse his wrist back at him while still being able to hold the revolver and pull the trigger. I don't know. And then if you think about recoil as well, and the fact that Van Gogh definitely wasn't a pro shooter, then the gun would have jerked upwards, which means that he probably was pointing at his stomach. I'm getting sidetracked. It was a weird way to do it. And this was backed up by a man called Vincent de Mayo, a chief medical examiner who Nayfair and Smith asked to examine the forensic evidence. And he confirmed the awkward angle at which Van Gogh would have had to have held the gun. He also said that there would have been black powder burns on his hands, tattooing and discoloration on his skin around the wound as well, and none of that was noted in the contemporary report. He stated, "It is my opinion that, in all medical probability, the wound incurred by Van Gogh was not self-inflicted. In other words, he did not shoot himself." And the other points, the missing paint and the missing revolver, were hard to explain at the time, and if viewed skeptically, could be factors pointing towards a potential cover-up. But interestingly, around 1960, a revolver was found in one of those Auvers wheat fields. The 7mm caliber matched that of the bullet that was retrieved from Van Gogh's body, and scientific analysis of the gun suggested that it had been in that field since about the 1890s. It would have also been a pretty low-powered revolver, which would explain why Van Gogh hadn't just obliterated his heart with one shot, and why it took him so long to ultimately die. And that gun was actually sold at auction in 2019 for $182,700, which just goes to show that no matter what, there will always be some out there with enough money to spend almost $200,000 on a rusty old gun that might have killed Van Gogh. I mean, you could have bought a house. I mean, maybe in 2019, not now. So, what does this all boil down to? Well, ultimately, we end up at killed by drunk child cowboy versus depressed artist doesn't know how to shoot gun. What do I think? Well, annoyingly, I'm kind of hovering in the middle, but somewhat leaning towards the latter. Vincent van Gogh was obviously a very depressed, troubled individual with immense talent, but without the resilience or the mental fortitude to handle the life of a poor artist in the late 1800s. And ultimately, I think he probably did kill himself. Nayfair and Smith make some compelling arguments, and with the evidence we do have, I don't think we can rule out their argument completely, but that's about as good as it gets. As with most things that happened 130 years ago, see my recent video about Jack the Ripper, we just can't prove anything conclusively. And ultimately, even if it was accidental, Van Gogh wanted to die. If we couldn't take the word of the man when he was on his actual deathbed, then when could we? And as unfortunate and sad as it is, Van Gogh was a man looking for a way out. And however it actually happened, he found it. Again, in the words of his brother Theo, who tragically only died 6 months after Van Gogh, and they're actually buried side by side in that small cemetery. One of his last words was, "I wish I could pass away like this." And his wish was fulfilled. A few moments and all was over. He had found the rest he could not find on earth.
Alright, I have no idea if I'm finished. I've run out of time, so I kind of have to be finished. Turns out it's really difficult to paint messily. I mean, it looks nothing like the original, but I guess that's not the point. This is difficult. I hate everything I've ever painted, so as usual, I have no idea whether this is good or not. But hey, I finished my first impasto painting, and hopefully Van Gogh would have been proud. But I might come back to it later when I realise that it sucks.
So what do you think? Is the story we've all known for 130 years the truth? Or was it really those meddling kids again? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And remember, if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.